Okay, welcome everybody to this Made at the Library event, which is the Library of Congress's book talk series featuring authors who have written their books by mining our collections. My name is Meg McAleer, and I am one of the historical specialists in the Manuscript Division. Among the collections I have responsibility for are the papers of George S. Patton, which, as I've said to many of you this evening, is definitely the gift that keeps on giving. How many people here, has anyone here researched the collection before on their own? Has anyone used it? Okay, you have, but based on the display you just saw, you know how rich this collection is. I mean, definitely through Patton's diaries, which are unfiltered and riveting, through his photographs, and he was a shutterbug, his correspondence, his military records, his maps, his scrapbooks, and so much more. And this is a collection that chronicles not just an extraordinary individual whom only Homer could have conceived of, but it's also an amazing chronicle on the history of the US military during the first half of the 20th century. So we are incredibly pleased that Kevin Hymel agreed to come and speak here tonight on his research in the Patton Papers to produce his 3 books, which include Patton's photographs, War as He Saw It, and the first 2 volumes of a projected 3-volume biography of Patton during World War II called Patton's War. Eagerly awaiting volume 3, by the way. So moderating tonight's book talk are my colleagues Bruce Kirby and Louis Wyman. And if you are reference librarians in the manuscript reading room, if any of you have used our reading room, then I know you share my absolute awe for their knowledge of history and our more than 12,000 collections in the Manuscript Division, as well as their deep, deep commitment to service. So I just want to also, quick reminder that tonight's book talk is being recorded. And so if you participate in the Q&A, we can pretty much guarantee you immortality. You are going to be part of that recording for forevermore. So without further ado, Bruce Kirby is going to introduce Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. That was very kind. There's a lot to like about working at the Library of Congress. My colleagues and I can participate in events like this. We can work with national treasures like those displayed in the next room. And we also meet many interesting people. On any given day in the manuscript reading room, we can be confident that some of the world's greatest experts in their fields are sitting, working quietly at their tables. And one of those experts is here with us tonight. Kevin M. Hymel is a contract historian at the Arlington National Cemetery and has served as historian at the U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth. At an early age, Kevin became interested in America's role in World War II, and that interest has guided him throughout his career. For 15 years, he was research director for the World War II History and Military Heritage magazines, and he wrote numerous articles for each. One of those articles on the 6888 Central Postal Battalion of the Women's Army Corps is being made into a movie by Tyler Perry, and Kevin has served as technical advisor for the film. He's appeared in numerous television documentaries on the History Channel and the American Heroes Channel, and you can also find him on a number of podcasts such as Somebody Talked by the National D-Day Memorial. He has met and interviewed a number of World War II veterans, including several members of the 101st Airborne Division that were immortalized as a band of brothers by Stephen Ambrose in his book. Kevin has a strong connection to the Ambrose legacy. For more than 15 years, he's been a historian and a tour guide with Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. One of his most popular tours is called In Patton's Footsteps. Many years ago, Kevin came across the albums of photographs taken by General George S. Patton Jr. during World War II that are part of his papers here at the library. Some of them are on display in the next room. He realized that the photographs shed new light on Patton's war experiences, so he wrote a book about them, Patton's Photographs, War as He Saw It. That was the beginning of a deep study of the general that continues today. He's now at work on a trilogy titled Patton's War, An American General's Combat Leadership. The first 2 volumes, as Meg said, have been published, and he's hard at work on the third. Sure. Kevin's research in libraries and archives is supplemented by the personal experiences of visiting the places where Patton fought, his headquarters, and even his favorite pub. I look forward to hearing what Kevin has to tell us.
Thank you, Bruce.
Sir.
Appreciate it, man. Make sure this is on. Yes, we're good. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see some friends and family and eager people to learn about General Patton. General Patton was probably one of our most successful, flamboyant, and aggressive commanders in World War II. As Bruce was saying, I've been studying him for about 20 years, mostly here at the Library of Congress, Manuscript Division, but also at different repositories around the globe. And that research, the facilities here have enabled me, and my predecessors have mentioned this, Patton's photographs. That was my first book. That were the photographs that Patton took with his own camera. Patton's War Volume 1, Patton's War Volume 2, and of course, Patton's War Volume 3, which is in the works right now. But what I'd like to talk about tonight are 5 incidents from Patton's World War II experiences and how the materials here at the Library of Congress kind of made them possible. Those 5 incidents are his first day in combat, November 8th, 1942, the death of his aide, Dick Jensen, on April 1st, 1943, his visit to Italy in January of 1944, his genuine surprise at the German offensive in the Ardennes, December 16th, 1944, which we all know as the Battle of the Bulge, and lastly, Patton when he took a swim in January of 1945. So to start off, this is the photograph of Patton on the first day of war. This is November 8th, 1942. He has just come ashore in Morocco at Fadala Beach. He's about 3 miles north of Casablanca, where Rick's place is with Humphrey Bogart. I found this picture in the photo collection that none of my predecessors seem to have accessed. And Patton liked this picture so much, he sent it back to his wife and said, this would make a great magazine or book cover. So here he is on the first day of war, and he already sees himself as this great commander worthy of articles and books. If you notice, this is one of only 2 photographs in existence that show his 2 ivory-handled pistols. Right after this, he resorts to only wearing 1. And I've interviewed lots of veterans who say, I remember him wearing those 2 those 2 holsters, those 2 guns. He didn't. He just wore them on this one day. But you'll notice also his pants are soaking wet. And that's because when he jumped out of his landing craft and came up the beach, he saw another landing craft stuck on a sandbar, and he ordered the troops around him to drop whatever they were doing and come out and push this landing craft back into the water. And as they did it, they were amazed to see a 2-star general standing next to them, pushing it out as it went to sea. So I mentioned that this is one of only 2 photographs. I don't want to tease you too much, so here's the other photograph taken just seconds afterwards. Patton does look a little stern here. That was a practice he made in front of mirrors with his war face. But I can tell you that I think he was actually happy to be there on this day, because there was a time where this assault was really under question. This attack is part of what's called Operation Torch, the first attempt to get Americans fighting the Germans and Italians in World War II. And in negotiations and in planning in Washington, D.C., our British counterparts were against this attack. The other 2 troop landings were going to be in Algiers, but the British felt that Morocco was just too far away from the fighting front in Libya, where Montgomery was fighting Field Marshal Rommel of the German army. And these negotiations became so intense that Patton got so mad, he marched out of one of the meetings, came home to his house in Washington, D.C., picked up a lava model of a Hawaiian god that he had gotten in Hawaii called Charlie, took it out into the backyard and spiked it into the pond in the backyard. Patton kind of felt the gods of war had turned against him, and he took it out on Charlie. Oddly enough, on November 8th, when he comes up this beach, one of the first people to greet him is a British liaison officer named Colonel Robert Enriquez. And what's he holding? Charlie, the Hawaiian war god. Beatrice had Charlie fished out of the pond, gave it to Robert Enriquez, and said, "Give this to my husband on the beach for good luck." And that's exactly what he did. So that's George S. Patton on day one of the war. The next incident I want to talk about where the Library of Congress was vital is the death of Dick Jensen. Now, if you've seen the movie Patton, he sends his aide, Dick Jensen, over to Bradley's command post a couple miles away, and while he's there, he gets bombed by the Luftwaffe and gets killed, and it's a very emotional moment in the movie. Patton wrote about this in his diary. Omar Bradley wrote about it in his memoirs, but I was doing research at the Army War College, and I found an unpublished memoir by one of Patton's staff members, a guy named Jack Copeland, and he said that whole story was made up. And the story was that Patton had sent Dick Jensen away to something called Benson Force. It was under Colonel Clarence Benson. He was an armor officer, and that's actually Dick Jensen standing next to him, kind of making notes there. They had visited him the day before, and Patton, what he did was, his 1st Armored Division was having trouble fighting the Germans. The 1st Infantry Division, however, was making progress. So what he did is he pulled an armored unit out of 1st Armored, Benson Force, and stuck it in the 1st Infantry to kind of push forward. In fact, that's Benson's command tank right there. Patton took a picture of it the day before. But Copeland said this whole story was made up. What actually happened was, on April 1st, 1943, Patton moved his headquarters 5 miles closer to the front. And this is something that Eisenhower told him and wrote down, that he said, "I want a corps commander, not a casualty." So Patton was actually disobeying Eisenhower's orders by moving closer to the front. And when he did that and started setting up camp, an artillery round came in from the Germans. So Patton ordered Copeland to run up a ridge to look over to see how far away the Germans were. Well, Copeland comes running back. He says, "I didn't even make it to the top of the ridge. The Germans are up there." And Patton says, "Oh, bull. I don't believe you." 2 hours later, a flight of Ju-88s comes out of the sky, bombs and shells the area, and kills Dick Jensen, feet away from Patton. Now, Copeland had some evidence. He had written some letters to people who were there that kind of reinforced his story. I didn't think it was really enough to write about, but I found another piece of evidence in the Manuscripts Division. Again, these were Patton's personal photographs, and this is the photograph. That is Al Stiller, a member of Patton's staff. He is standing in the shell hole from the bomb, and that little hole in front of him was the slit trench that Dick Jensen was in. So Patton took this photograph with his own camera. Now, maybe he gave the camera to someone else to take it, but in my research of the general, he never let that camera out of his sight. The only time he gave it up was to let someone else take a picture of him. So to me, this was the definitive evidence that Patton was at the spot where Dick Jensen was killed. He knew that he was in trouble for doing this and covered it up so he would stay in command. Next story. So Patton's going to go on to command 7th Army in Sicily. He's going to capture about 2/3 of the island in the strategic city of Messina. But he's going to get in trouble after this great victory because in 2 different hospitals, he slaps 2 different soldiers suffering from PTSD. And he's basically going to go into exile in Sicily while the war progresses in Italy. He's very depressed during this time. He drinks too much. He's just kind of wallowing in his own misery. So to kind of pick himself up, he flies over to Italy to see, the war in action. And he visits Jeffrey Keyes, one of his, who was actually his deputy chief of staff in Sicily, and now he's a corps commander in Italy. And they go touring the front, and while they're walking along a ridge, Patton stops, and he takes this photograph here. Now, you see the splotches on the top corners? That's actually the glue holding the picture into the photo album itself. But he looked down into this valley, and he saw some artillery guns, which are very hard to spot because they're under white tents. I don't know if you can see those. But he said that this actual photograph, saved his life. Because he said, if I did not stop and take my camera out of the case and get the picture right and take this picture, I would have been killed. because about 30 yards up the road, there's a huge explosion of enemy artillery. It destroys the road, it rips apart the trees, and Patton said, if I hadn't taken this picture, I would have been standing right here. So you can see how badly damaged these trees are. Patton said that this was a sign from God, that he was being saved for future glory. He later told people that the entire experience gave him courage and kind of re-strengthened him. So something that I think would have terrified a lot of people, he takes as a confidence builder in World War II. So next story. Now, one of the things Patton is famous for, and it's in the movie Patton, is that he predicts the Battle of the Bulge. Any historian writing after 1953 tells this story, and they all trace it back to this diary entry. And I know it's kind of hard for you guys to see, but this is November 25th, 1944. And remember, the Battle of the Bulge starts on December 16th, 1944. So on November 25th, he writes, furthermore, the First Army is making a terrible, I wish I had my glasses, mistake by leaving the 8th Corps static, and it is highly probable that the Germans are building up east of them. And just in case any historian missed it, they put a number 1, and you go to the bottom and it says, it was opposite 8th Corps that von Rundstedt launched his attack 21 days later. So even if you miss it, there's the reminder. So these are transcripts that his wife put together. And it's amazing. Patton predicts the Battle of the Bulge. Oh my God, he's a psychic. Except he didn't do it. Using the Library of Congress, I was able to access the actual handwritten diaries. And you can see, if you look where the paragraph kind of ends, you can see where November 26 starts. There's nothing, that sentence is not there. It does not exist. Now here's the thing. He did write something like that. He just didn't do it on that day. If you advance to December 27th, now remember, December 16th, the Battle of the Bulge starts. Patton drives his army north to the surrounded town of Bastogne and relieves it on the 26th of December. The next day, he writes in his diary, and it's down there at the bottom, of course, Bradley made a bad mistake by leaving passive at the front the 8th Corps. So what his wife did is she took this sentence from December 27th and pulled it back to November 25th to make her husband look clairvoyant. There's other evidence that he did not predict the Bulge. He held a number of press conferences where he said the Germans don't have the strength to launch a large attack against us. He was getting daily intelligence reports that said the Germans just can't do this. But it's really this that's the culprit. This is the thing that kind of bumps him up from military genius to prophet. And he just didn't do it. He fought the battle brilliantly, but he did not predict it. Now, I can't take credit for this. It's really the Library of Congress. It was a group that calls themselves By the People. By the People. So during the pandemic, a group of people that are actually, some of whom are in this room, transcribed these diaries word for word and put them online. So I was able to access them and tell a whole new story about Patton, and I could not have done it without them. So I appreciate that, guys. Next story. Actually, this is the last one. Again, I came across this in the Manuscripts Division. This was in Patton's scrapbooks. So he would cut out articles about himself and send them home throughout the war, and his wife would post them into scrapbooks until the slapping incidents, and she refused to do it and gave the job to her daughter, one of her daughters. So I came across this, how Patton swam Sur River under fire to inspire troops. Now this is a March 7th, 1945 article. What happened was a soldier named Sergeant Thomas Deffenbaugh came home as one of the heroes of the Battle of the Bulge, and he told this story that Patton swam across this river in Germany, which is incorrect. The Sur River is actually in Luxembourg, to take the town of Bettendorf. Now, this story went across the United States. It was in Stars and Stripes. I mean, it was everywhere. Bob Hope made jokes about it. But it just seemed fantastical until I did further research. Again, in Patton scrapbooks, in the Manuscript Division, I found another article. This is from November of 1947, and this was about a soldier who wrote a letter to Patton after his death. This guy was an MP, and he said, I remember this day. I remember seeing Patton swim across this river. Now, the third piece of evidence I came across, I can't show you a slide about, but Also here at the Library of Congress, something called the Veterans History Collection. So these are firsthand primary accounts of soldiers and sailors and airmen who would give their papers or send an interview to the Library of Congress so it could be stored. And I found an interview with this young man and a veteran said, "I remember seeing Patton swim this river." So what I've been able to put together from these 3 stories is that on January 21st, Patton came south of this town called Bettendorf to the Sur River. There was about a foot of snow on the ground. It was about a couple degrees below zero. The 4th Infantry Division had been trying to cross this river, using landing craft and inflatable rafts, and they just kept getting machine gunned or shelled by the Germans. They tried building a bridge. The Germans shelled it. So Patton is watching these guys kind of climb into a small boat to shove off across the river, and he says, "You guys look like sitting pigeons. Don't go across like that. Swim the river." And they're all like, "Are you nuts?" There's ice actually flowing in the water. And they start to balk at this idea. So Patton takes off his pistol belt, takes off his coat, gives them to Sergeant Mims, his car driver, climbs down into the river, swims the river about 60 yards long, swims back, and is climbing out of the river. And he says, "So what's the problem?" And the soldiers, they immediately go down into the river. They swim across. They said they fought like banshees, and they took Bettendorf by that night. So I think that's a great example of a general making a difference in one of those millions of small ways on a battlefield to keep his army moving, to keep it fighting. So to conclude this story, I actually found in the Baltimore Sun an artist's sketch of this incident. It's not completely accurate, but I think it kind of sums up the spirit of what Patton did. And so there is Patton. I don't know if the diving board was there, and if we kept a flag on him with the word Patton, but yeah, so that's kind of the revelation and the way they portrayed it. So I'd like to conclude by saying I really couldn't have done any of this without the Library of Congress, without the wonderful collections here. There are millions of stories hidden in the Library of Congress. It just takes a little scraping to get down the surface and find them. I encourage all of you to do it because we have probably the greatest library in the world right here in Washington, D.C. So thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, Kevin, you're sending me back to the collection. I've got some things to dive into. We're going to go into the next phase now, and my colleagues Bruce and Lewis are going to be interviewing Kevin.
Thank you, Meg. I have many questions, Kevin, and thank you for that presentation.
Rock and roll, buddy.
Any one of these could go first, but I'm going to start with a topic that was covered a lot in your books, I think. It's full of examples of what I would call his callousness towards his troops.
Yes.
Except for close individuals like Dick Jensen and his son-in-law. Mm-hmm. But in your book, in Volume 1, after he acquires his dog Willie, there's an example where he gets bumped by a car and gets a scrape, and you say he showed about as much sympathy to Willie as he did for his troops. Mm-hmm. And so, but he also seemed to take pride in their training and their toughness and their capabilities. So I'm wondering, you've talked to veterans, you've seen the veterans' interviews. How did the troops feel about Patton?
It changed over time. Originally, a lot of them hated him for his draconian, I would call it draconian discipline. But remember, when he comes in to Tunisia, he's facing a defeated corps. They've been mauled really badly at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. He feels like the discipline was poor, so he's going to kind of go in the extreme the other way. And unfortunately, his bias really shows. He's a lot nicer to tankers than he is to the infantry. He's really rough on the infantry. But in some quarters, it's considered a badge of honor to be hit by Patton. Guys brag about it. So by the time you get to the continent, the race across France, Battle of the Bulge, he was a known entity, and it was kind of an honor to be serving in his army. And you looked forward to his toughness. And as the war progresses, he starts to soften because he knows these men have been in combat, they've been fighting. He'll yell at somebody, and they'll say, "Well, General, we knocked out 3 German tanks here." And you know what? Never mind. I'll walk away. So it becomes tempered as the war goes on. But like I said, it's pretty draconian in North Africa. But like I said, he was trying to reestablish a defeated force. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I have a question about Patton's health. In 1925, he had an official physical exam that lists about 21 injuries. 6 of those were to his head, some of them requiring stitches, including 1 concussion and partial paralysis, and also burns and broken bones and a gunshot wound, various other injuries. In your research, did you encounter evidence that this might have affected his personality or his ability to cope with the rigors of command and combat?
Oh boy. Especially the concussions. I think, yes, I've seen the listing of his injuries very much from as a kid, an outdoorsman, loved doing stuff outdoors. He loved horseback riding. He loved playing polo. I think my brother had similar injuries when we were growing up. He liked skateboarding a lot more than I did. Yes, I think the concussions did have a very profound effect on him because you would see him very optimistic in 1 second and then crying the next. So his behavior would be kind of erratic from that. And I think knowing what we know today about concussion protocols and things like that, that playing polo, you're riding horses, you're falling off horses. It's a very violent sport in a lot of ways. I think affected him. I think it was really polo more than football. He played football till he broke his leg at West Point. And you mentioned the gunshot injury. That was actually from one of his ivory-handled pistols. He was demonstrating pistol safety and went to holster it and shot himself. So after that, he always kept that chamber empty on his pistol so he wouldn't repeat that. But yeah, I definitely see that effect. And, back in those days, that was always, your scars and everything were a badge of honor. And so I think he took pride in a lot of his injuries.
Okay, I have one about his image, you could say. In group photos, it's easy to identify Patton, especially when he's standing with people like Omar Bradley or Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who didn't wear their uniforms as neatly as he did. He's recognizable from his boots, from his posture, from his shiny helmet, his buttoned chin strap, cavalry pants, revolvers, riding crop. He also famously insisted that his troops tighten their uniforms, wear them buttoned up, wear the chin straps. So what role do you think that his image played in his leadership style?
I know that he took it very seriously. I remember there's one general asked him why he dresses that way because he thought Patton looked foolish. And he said, no, the troops will know me when I approach by what I wear because I'm very distinct with the ivory-handled pistol. He would often wear jodhpurs or riding pants, from the cavalry. He didn't always wear that glossy helmet liner. He usually wore the regular helmet. And the what's called an Eisenhower jacket, which cuts off at the waist, it wasn't until he went to England that he had a tailor make a special one for him with all the gold buttons. Nobody else really wore gold buttons, but he said he did that specifically, and he would wear all of his ribbons whenever he would see British General Montgomery, because he just loved ticking him off. And but that goes all the way back to when he served under John J. Pershing in World War I and in Mexico, because Pershing was very big on comportment and dress. And so Patton took that on early in his career, but by the time he became a general, he wanted to be distinct on the battlefield. Now, as for leadership, I have talked to some veterans that say, this guy started heading at me and I recognized the ivory-handled pistol and the pants, and I knew I was in trouble. So I can't give you anything statistical, just anecdotal, that yes, these guys recognize him. And often, especially in North Africa, when he would visit the troops, they would say, this is the first time we saw a general at the front, much less a colonel. So he really, not just the uniform, but his actions of being up front and looking distinct, I think made a big difference.
I have a question speculating about alternative history. What if Patton hadn't succumbed to his injuries in December of 1945 and died and lived on? Would he have continued on in the Army and taken a post in the United States, or do you think he would have retired and back in the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, he said he was going to retire. Any job that he was qualified for had already been taken by somebody else. I think he really wanted to teach at West Point or be the head of West Point. I mean, the guy was a 4-star general. You're not going to have him teaching classes or teach, be the head of the armor school, but they'd already given those billets away to other people. So he said, when I get home, I'm just going to retire. We're going to build an extra wing onto our house where I can put all the things I've collected from World War II and basically make a museum to himself. So that was the plan. And they also had a yacht called the When and If, when he retires, if he retires, and they were going to sail that around the seas. But all those plans got interrupted by a car accident. So I think he really was talking about retirement. Unfortunately, Patton's prejudices were starting to come out in 1945. He was, strongly anti-Semitic, very racist. So I kind of cringe and worry about reporters showing up at his house and interviewing him about the world as it is today in 1948 and how he might not have liked the changes in the world. So I would hope that he would have retired quietly.
One follow-up question, do we know what happened to Willie?
So Willie was sent home to the house in Massachusetts, the house that Patton owned, and his wife and children, when they were unpacking the stuff for Willie, one of the things in the box was a bust of Adolf Hitler. And they were like, what is this for? And they put it down on the ground, and Willie immediately peed on it. And so they realized that Patton had trained Willie this way, so they put the bust of Adolf Hitler out in the backyard, and that was Willie's place to salute. Now, I got to tell you, I always get I can't understand why I get this question, but a lot of times I get it, when did Willie die? And I honestly don't know. And I've asked the Patton grandchildren, they don't know either, so I apologize of my poor research skills.
Well, Kevin, sorry, not Patton.
Don't call me Patton. Somebody did that earlier.
Louis and I both have a lot more questions, but I'm wondering if, I'm not sure what the time situation is, but we should see if the audience has any questions that they want to ask.
Yes, ma'am. Jen?
Actually, I'm going to...
Kevin and I work together, so I'm familiar with your research, but it is another experience to actually see these documents that you write about. And I want to get back to something that's been touched on in the previous questions, which is how have you dealt with the challenge in your 20 years of writing about Patton of squaring his incredibly outsized, kind of culturally iconic significance with the man that you see in your own research? And so I guess that's kind of like the first part of my question. Like, you're dealing with somebody who is so concerned with managing his public image, right? Like the war face, the newspaper clippings. So the first question is kind of like, how did you go about like getting underneath that? And then secondly, in your work, like you strike a balance of analysis and empathy. So like, what is your ultimate takeaway of how Patton's personality and his particular life experience influenced his leadership as a general? Thank you.
Okay, let me see if I can remember this. So for the first question, it's easy to get overwhelmed by a very famous person, especially researching them. It's like, there's endless amounts of material and you're just one person. And so I think I was very lucky. I came into the Library of Congress to write a paper on the day Patton met MacArthur in World War I. So I had a very specific thing I was looking into. And it was when I opened the index on the Patton collection that I saw photo album, photo album, photo album. And so I ordered the photo albums, and I was looking through all those pictures, and I'd never seen any of these before, and realized he had taken them with his own camera. So I thought, okay, here's another niche of Patton that I can tackle. I'm not trying to tell his story, I'm going to give you another dimension of him. But in doing that, I learned so much about him that it kind of gave me the courage to make that next step. And what I decided to do was not try to tell some profound story, just go by the details. Find as many, stories as you can, combine them together, because a lot of Patton biographers just relied on his diaries and letters, where because of the Library of Congress, I had access to, I think I researched 2,500 soldiers' memoirs in the reading room. I looked at hours and hours, if not days and weeks of interviews in the Veterans Collection. So I just took it one day at a time and, you know, his story one day at a time, and just tried not to freak out by the amount of material and everything that's been said about him before. So that's one. The second is my takeaway. I guess what I always tell people is, you know, fantastic person to study when it comes to strategy, tactics, war-winning attitude. Don't touch him for social tolerances. You know, he's not even a product of his time. He's a product of the 1850s in a lot of ways. And, you know, but as an historian, my job is to tell the truth, you know, and, you know, people say, like, don't you love Patton? And I'd say, well, when I was a kid, I did. I saw the movie. I thought he was so cool. But then the more research I did, I found his failings and mistakes, and you got to say that stuff too. And what's impressed me with my books is people coming back and saying, Hymel, like they say, like, I say all his faults and everything, yet he still comes out as a great man. So what he accomplished in his career, you know, I don't say outweighs his failings, but it doesn't really tarnish him as much as I thought it might. And we all have failings. And, you know, we all know our own weaknesses. And so I think that's what makes what the portrait of Patton I've provided more human. Yep.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the talk. It's fantastic. So, a long time ago, as a young lieutenant, I read Patton's book, War as I Knew It, and there are some jaw-dropping moments in that book. He wrote some stuff that just blew my mind, and you already mentioned the racism, which was, but besides that, there was an incident that happened in the book, and it was very short, and he mentions it and moves on, and like, where's the rest of that story? So maybe you know. There was an incident where he was watching some artillery with some a new cannon or something in the States in a training mode, and it misfired, or a soldier was killed instantly, blew his head off, like on the training ground. And of course, we know what happened today. There'd immediate ceasefire, there'd be investigation, everybody be interviewed, blah, blah, blah. You know, it'd take a year to put the piece of gear back in. But Patton's, in the book, he said his concern was if he didn't correct this, they'd never use the gun again. So he went down and fired the next shot to make sure that his soldiers had confidence in the weapon. I'm like, what? That's it. That's all he said. Like, what was the deal with that? I mean, that soldier was killed, and he barely mentions it.
Yeah, that's time of war for you right there. I know the story you're talking about. I haven't done research into that because my research started really November 8th, 1944. But yeah, those training incidents were happening all the time all over the United States. And men were getting crushed by tanks. Men were jumping out of planes in high winds and getting killed. And the government would send a letter to the family and give them money and move on. That unfortunately is one of the residuals of war that people don't really talk about. There was an incident in England where a B-17 bomber was going through. They'd taken it up, just two pilots, because they had done some repairs on it, and a storm came by and catapulted it into a kindergarten and basically wiped out a whole generation of this British town. And that's one of those residual things that happens in wartime that just gets overshadowed. So yeah, that's just war, unfortunately. Sorry. Question?
So you have a really unique writing style.
Could you speak into the mic?
Yeah, of course. You have a really unique writing style that I really appreciate. Where did your love of writing and writing history and writing about military history specifically come from?
So when I was a kid, I had the largest collection of G.I. Joes on the block. Right, Greg? Yeah? Yep. And I would write stories about my G.I. Joes and show them to my parents. And so I'm 57 years old now, and I'm still doing it. So just a lifelong love of writing about military history stuff and G.I. Joes.
That's funny. Excuse me, thank you. So I'm interested in how far you got into Patton's relationship with his subordinate commanders, corps and division level, a little bit in North Africa, but more interestingly from Normandy on, because some of them come and go, and one I was specifically interested in, if you'd had any exposure to, was what happened to General John Wood?
P. Wood, the 4th Armored Division commander. Right. Yeah, Jack Wood. So Patton, he had positive relationships with his division and corps commanders, but he would yell and scream at them if he didn't like what they were doing, and they all kind of knew it was coming. Mantonetti just got berated from time to time. But Jack Wood was the commander of the 4th Armored Division. He was considered a genius of armored warfare, but he kept kind of, you could almost say pulling Pattons. You know, he kept kind of disobeying orders and doing different things that he should have been doing. And he would get into arguments with his direct boss, Mantonetti, because he said, you don't understand tank warfare, you're an infantry guy. And he would yell at Mantonetti, which you're not supposed to do to your superior. And Mantonetti went to Patton once about it, and Mantonetti was really worried because he knew Jack Wood and Patton were good friends. But Patton, to his credit, wrote a letter to Jack Wood and said, you straighten up or you're out of here. So he backed Mantonetti over his friend. And when Wood did it again, and there were witnesses that said, you know, that Wood had kind of gone bat crazy, that whenever he wasn't moving, he would get really stir crazy. And so he did it again, and Patton kept his word to Eddie. He sent Jack Wood home, and Wood never blamed Patton. For some reason, he blamed Eisenhower for it, because he thought Eisenhower was in charge of all strategy and wasn't doing what he should have been doing, and put Patton in this bind. But instead of sending him home in disgrace, they said they were sending him home for more training, or, you know, they just said he's just fatigued. They never promoted the fact that he was insubordinate. So he kind of left the window open for his career. And he said, if anybody thinks of demoting Wood, I'm going to bring him back. You know, he really thought very highly of Wood. But Wood did go to the United States, and he wrote a memoir that never got published. And I met an Army colonel when I was working at Fort Leavenworth. I hear a lot of jokes about that. And he shared that unpublished memoir with me. So I've incorporated it into my book, Volume 2. So I encourage you to get it at the Library of Congress. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering about some of the doubt over his public image and the folk hero stories that was happening with him, especially for like the crossing of the icy river. Was that happening during the war or after, or was this like a public doubt that people saw when they read the article and they're like, no, that couldn't have possibly happened? Or is it like a biographer later on trying to fact check?
Well, so for that story in particular, a lot of guys, I read guys in the 80th Infantry Division said, oh, what really happened is there was a fjord and Patton went across that. And that's why people got it all mixed up. And like I said, only that one article really spread at the time during the war, so there was a lot of doubt. There was another story. He was south of Metz in Nancy, and the Germans shelled where he was living, and they basically just collapsed the house across the street. So he ran over and helped extricate this husband and wife from the rubble, but he got his PR guys involved, and in the story, so he's basically digging through rubble to help get these people, but the story that went out to the press had him basically getting underneath like an I-beam and lifting it up with his shoulders to get them out. And there were lots of fantastical stories about Patton that I had to kind of knock down in a lot of my research. So a lot of myths about him. And in fact, just recently in the Journal of Military History, there was a story about sort of the toxic masculinity of the airborne troops, and that they were, you know, known for pillaging and raping on their off time. And one of my fellow historians is very upset with this because he said the guy didn't prove his case. He's bad-mouthing the airborne. I said, are you kidding me? I'm just glad they're not blaming Patton, because usually whenever there was something really successful or a huge failure, they would always attach to Patton's name because he was the most recognizable fighter in the European theater. Good question. We got one right here. Someone will be with you right shortly. Yeah.
His pistols seemed very important to him. Were they a gift from someone or a souvenir from like the Mexican intervention or anything?
The pistols?
Yes.
Yeah. So he got the original, I think it was the Colt 45 he got first. And when he was in Mexico chasing down Pancho Villa's bandits, he attacked a ranch and got into a gunfight with some horseback riders. This guy's name was Cardenas. He was one of the main lieutenants to Pancho Villa. And Patton helped kill 2 of the 3 bandits. And while that fight was going on, he ran out of bullets. and had to like kind of duck behind a wall. And he said he was reloading and all this dust was coming from the adobe bricks that were getting, pecked by bullets. And he said, I'm never going to find myself in battle with just one gun again. So that's when he got the 357 Magnum to join that. And, really wore those through the rest of the war. In fact, the Colt 45, he cut 2 notches on the handle for the 2 Mexicans that he killed. So really kind of relished in that stuff. Actually, and I've held both pistols. They had them on display down at Fort Knox, and they closed the museum and let me hold them because of my book. So if you ever want to handle Patton's weapons, just write a book about them. Opens up all kinds of doors. Yes, sir. We got 2.
This is a question about armored warfare. Was there a seminal moment that got Patton really interested and saw the efficacy of armored mechanized warfare?
I would have to say no. So he first learns about it in World War I. And really, you're just reading about it in newspapers and things like that. And back then, every young officer wanted to command an infantry regiment. That's where you really got to see action. And Patton had been reading about this new thing called a tank. And he went back and forth for a little while and then decided to go into the tank corps. And it's so new that we didn't have any doctrine or anything. He would go to the tank factories to figure out how they were made. So he really just involved himself, but there was no one moment. He really was risking his career. It could have been a boondoggle. They did break down on the battlefield, but he really invested his career in it. He really saw it as the future. And in a way, it was like he was the perfect guy for it because he spoke French, and they were using French tanks. He had commanded a machine gun unit at one point, and he loved cars and working on cars, so he understood the combustion engine. So those 3 things really kind of came together in the tank, but there wasn't a real seminal moment that took him in. It was a risky career move. Yes, sir.
With all the research you've done into his history, what's one event or something from his life that you think was really surprising or really important?
Let's see. So the question is an incident of Patton's life that I found really interesting or like kind of threw me off that I'd never seen before. Well, the big one was not predicting the Battle of the Bulge. Because it's funny, all the evidence was there. Because when they tell him, hey, listen, you got to transfer units up north because there's this huge German attack, he goes to his division commanders and says, hey, start attacking south because I don't want you guys getting caught up in this. So, I mean, all the evidence was there that he didn't realize how big it was, how important it was. When, who was the Mantonetti is the corps commander that's just getting overwhelmed. And when Omar Bradley calls him and says, hey, send 10th Armored up to Mantonetti, he's getting wiped out. Patton called up Walton Walker, his own corps commander, and said, hey, go check with Eddie. I think they're exaggerating it. I don't think this is a big deal. And Walker calls him back 10 minutes later and says, no, it's even worse than what we said. And that's when Patton starts to realize the gravity of the situation. So it was that realization that he didn't predict it. It wasn't a perfect, Patton situation. It was something that it blindsided him as much as everybody else. And he had to make up for lost time. So that was probably one of the biggest. I guess the second one was Patton had a mistress during World War II, Jean Gordon, his niece, but it's okay, it was on his wife's side, so it wasn't bad. And I knew about them getting together in England, but in my further research, I mean, all these people are going to his headquarters and going, boy, he's got some real pretty candy stripers with him. So, and then I would find other evidence that she was at his headquarters. It was so bad, Patton's wife found out about it, and she wrote him and said, hey, this congresswoman just came back from the front. She says, Jean Gordon's there, that you've got all these, how did she put it? All these WACs, Women Auxiliary Corps women. And Patton found a loophole. He wrote back and said, we don't have any WACs in my headquarters. She was a candy striper with the Red Cross. So he said, we don't have any of those WACs, so that's impossible. Plus, I'm way too busy. But the one that really shocked me, I think it was Everett Hughes's diary that you showed me. So Everett Hughes worked under General Eisenhower, and when the Battle of the Bulge starts on December 16th, he walks out of Eisenhower's Reims. He's got a headquarters in a place called Reims, and he said he walked out and he sees Patton's personal plane circling and coming into land, and he goes, oh my God, No one's there to greet Patton, so he runs out to the plane, and out steps Jean Gordon. Patton was getting her out of the way for the Battle of the Bulge. So the involvement, the extent of his involvement with Jean Gordon really blew me away. And that story always turns people's heads too. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Kevin. So hypothetically, if you could ask General Patton 2 questions, what would they be?
Ooh, man. Pass the fried chicken? No, what would I ask him? Well, it would probably be something about Jean Gordon, and that's not cool. When did Willie die? No, what would I ask him? Yeah, I've rarely been stumped on a Patton question before. My God, could Eisenhower, could Einstein be there? Okay, if I could ask Patton any question, I guess. All right, so I'm trying to think of the questions I ask veterans, and one of them, and I usually do this as a setup. I always ask them. I said, if you could go back and do it all again, would you do anything different? And usually they say no. I would have lived my life the way I did it. So that would be one. And then the other patented, well, that's a wrong term, another question that I often use when interviewing vets, because sometimes they don't want to open up, and they're giving you just straight answers, to everything. And so I always ask them, what's the best meal and worst meal you had during the war? And that's a real personal thing, and that brings back stark memories. And I always get a good story out of that. And so I'd probably just ask him that. But yeah, the tone of the question that you asked, I really don't have a good answer for. So that's the best I can do. Good one, Brooke. Yes, way in the back.
I think you've articulated pretty well how distinctive General Patton was and all he did, to include his leadership style in the 1940s. Now, I'd like to know your thoughts on whether or not today's warfighter will be receptive to his leadership style in today's environment. And also the DOD at large as well.
What was the last part?
The warfighter and DOD. Whether or not the warfighter and DOD will be receptive to his leadership style?
Oh, yeah. That's kind of a tough question. Actually, the one I always get, and you see this all the time, if we only had a Patton fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan, he would have made it, it would have been different. And I always think that's such an insult because we train our officers and our soldiers so well in the Army that that's kind of a slight on them. I think Patton would have difficulty in the world today. There was an incident, there was a tank battalion, the 761st Tank Battalion, the only all-black tank battalion to fight in World War II. It had some white officers in it. And Patton went and addressed them, and in his address he says, don't let me down and don't let your race down. And a lot of the guys were very resentful of that. But I actually found an interview with one of the soldiers from the unit, and he said that, they all went to button up, get in their tanks, and somebody told Patton that there was a 76 millimeter cannon tank, which was unique and new to the Army. So he ran, they said that he ran and jumped up on the tank like a 20-year-old kid. He was 59 at the time, and jumped down into the turret and turned to the gunner, and he said, if you see anything through these crosshairs, you shoot it. Do you understand me, boy? And the soldier was furious. He said he grew up in segregated South. There was no way he was going to say yes, sir, to someone calling him boy. And Patton leaned in and said, I said, if you see anyone through these crosshairs, you destroy him. Did you understand me, boy? And he stood there and he said, yes, General. Patton didn't even notice it, got out of the tank, went on with his day. So I think his prejudices from the 1940s and 30s would have really hurt him as a commander. I don't know if he could have enlightened himself enough to be a good commander today. Did I answer your question all right? All right. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Jeff.
Can you lighten us a little bit about this movie that's coming out with the
Oh, the 6888?
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I'm not writing about Patton, I do a lot of veteran interviews, and boy, back in, I think it was like 2009, I wrote an article about this unit in the U.S. Army, the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. This is the only all-female, all-black unit to go overseas in World War II. It got good reception when it came out, and then it just kind of went beyond. I was working on other things. And at Fort Leavenworth back in, I think it was like 2016, they started building a monument to these ladies. And so they reached out to me, I connected with them, and I said, listen, I'll do you a favor, I'll interview, they said they found 3 veterans from the unit still alive. And I had interviewed 3 of them years ago. And I said, well, give me one of the ladies and I'll interview her and we'll have the article come out in time for the monument. It'll be a nice tribute. And her name was Lena King, and she was a hoot. I had a lot of fun interviewing her. We became very good friends. And so I wrote her article up, and a couple months later, 2 producers approached me and said, we want to make this into a movie. And I think at first it was going to be Michelle Obama who really liked it, and they were going to make it with Netflix. And then they called me a couple months later, and they said, actually shift it over now. It's Tyler Perry. And so Tyler Perry would call me up every couple of days, and I'd help him work on the script. He flew me down to Atlanta to be on set for the filming. They wrapped up in England a couple weeks ago, maybe about a month ago. And the prediction is that the movie's going to come out for Netflix in September, but with the writer's strike, I don't know. But very excited about it. Hope it leads to other Patton projects too. But yeah, it's the story of the 6888. Thanks, Jeff.
Interviews with the women from this unit up on the VHP website?
Nope. But if you Google Kevin Hymel 6888, you can find most of them. I think 2 were in WWII History Magazine. 1 was in Army Magazine. And then the original article I did was on point for the Army Historical Foundation. So I'm all over the place.
In the reading room, we call him Hollywood Hymel.
Better than you calling me Patton. Follow-up question, Jeff.
This dealing back to Patton and the rivalry with MacArthur, is that?
MacArthur? Sure.
Is the story of that rivalry during the war?
So during World War II, they're on opposite ends of the globe. You know, Patton's in Europe. MacArthur at this point is probably getting right close to the Philippines. And MacArthur, I think it's about October of '44, puts out this blistering statement that Patton doesn't know what he's doing at Metz. He's all screwed up. He messed up everything in North Africa. And it's just this blistering public statement. But really what it was is, I'm not getting the supplies I deserve. I'm the most important general. I'm on the most important front. And the United States is making a huge mistake giving all this stuff. And he would say Patton, but it was really Eisenhower who had been MacArthur's aide at one point. So he just kind of because Patton was the big name, though, in Europe. And so he directed all of his hatred and rage at Patton. As far as January 1945, which as far as I've gotten in my book writing on Volume 3, never mentions MacArthur. You know, and he met him at World War I on a battlefield. There were troops going past them. They were coming down a hill, and a German artillery barrage started marching towards them. Everybody ducked but Patton and MacArthur. They just stood there and talked, and Patton later said, neither one of us really cared what the other one was saying. We just didn't want to look like cowards in front of everybody. So there you go. You again. Yeah. Someone will be with you with a microphone in 3, 2, 1.
So could you talk a little bit about Patton's death and the conspiracy theories around it?
No. So I get this a lot because there's been books on it, and I've helped edit a few of them. So Patton was killed in a car accident, December, I think it was 10th, 1945. Not a big deal. There was a train crossing. It was on one side. There were 2 trucks on the other. The first truck stalled out, so the truck behind it pulled out into the wrong lane and caused an accident about 35 miles an hour. Nobody's hurt except Patton. He's got a big old gash on his head because he went up and hit the light on top of his limo. And when he landed, Hap Gay, Brigadier General, Chief of Staff, is sitting next to him. And he says, I think I'm paralyzed, Hap. Rub my fingers. So Hap starts rubbing him, and he says, I think I'm paralyzed, rub my fingers. And, you know, Hap said at that point he knew Patton was paralyzed. So he's brought to a hospital in Heidelberg on the first floor. I've actually been to it. He lingers for about 10 days and dies from a blood clot in the lung, which is common with paralysis. So he died. At the funeral, he's buried in Hamm, Luxembourg. In the 1970s, a story came out by French communists that, and this actually happened, and if you've seen, what is that, the guys that found all the treasures all over Europe. Monuments Men. If you've seen Monuments Men, the Salzburg mine, not only did it hold art, but it held gold from all the countries in Europe. And it was brought up and accounted for and brought back. Well, the story, though, the myth or the conspiracy theory is that Patton found all this gold and wanted to give it to all the people of Europe, and Eisenhower didn't. So he had Patton killed. So that was the first story. The second story, a guy named Wilson, I feel guilty for having helped him research it. He said that the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, some OSS Americans had been captured by the Soviets during World War II, and after Roosevelt died and Truman came into office, Stalin approached the head of the OSS, Wild Bill Donovan. And Roosevelt loved Donovan, Truman didn't. And Donovan says, well, I'm going to be out of a job now. So Stalin says to him, if you kill Patton, I'll give you your OSS guards back. And so they had an OSS guy hide in the bushes, and just as the truck hit Patton's car, he shot some kind of device that hit Patton in the neck and paralyzed him. They sent him to the hospital, and the Soviets had the technology to make poison gas that they sprayed through the window. But I've actually seen the call sheet for all the nurses. Patton was never alone in the room at all, ever. You know, the nurses had to check in and check out and relieve each other. And so it's all just a bunch of garbage.
Kevin, I think we have time for one more question.
And I think the person's got the mic right there. Is it my favorite color?
Hello?
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today at the library. And I just want to put a very quick plug in for the By the People crowdsourced transcription program that Kevin Hymel used for this book. Everybody in this room is invited to transcribe Library of Congress collections. If you visit crowd.loc.gov, we have tens of thousands of pages that still need transcription. Patton's war diaries are complete, unfortunately, but folks in this room might be interested to know that we've got pages from Clara Barton and President Teddy Roosevelt right now that need transcribers. And this always helps the library reach new people and make our collections more discoverable and accessible for everybody.
I would say yes.
And we have postcards if you would like one.
There you go. Easiest question of the night. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Carlin. That's great. I think this is a nice time to wrap it up. I'd like to thank the multimedia group for hosting us, and thanks to Andrea and Ariel for helping, my colleagues Meg and Louis for being part of it, and thank you very much, Kevin.